Hello, I'm Chris Watson and welcome to the changing sound of radio. We're going to look at some of the ways technological advances have shaped the radio we listen to, from the very first outside broadcast to binaural sound.
There's a blank in my head, there was a blank, and then awake. Am I awake? Hello?
Imagine a forest.
We'll be dropping in on the radiophonic workshop, hearing the ocean turned into an orchestra and revisiting technology from the past. You've just heard a short clip from the first ever BBC outside broadcast, The Nightingale and the Cello, Beatrice Harrison's 1924 duet with a nightingale. It was also the first live wildlife broadcast, something which interests me because I'm a sound recordist with a particular interest in the sounds of the natural world. And for more than 30 years, I've been recording sound on location all around the world for television, films and radio programs, all of which I bring back here to listen to in my home studio. And despite being surrounded here with all my current technology, I've got my original tape recorder here on the desk, an inspired gift from my parents in 1967 when I was 14 years old. And it's a national reel-to-reel tape recorder. And for the first time in several decades, we've put some batteries inside this machine. I've found a tiny spool of 1/4-inch tape from that period, laced it up onto the machine. Beautiful technique. And I'm going to switch to play and just hope that we hear something.
Collar fully inflated. We'll have no word as to when we might expect to see the crew open that hatch and come out and take a breath of earth air. It's definitely frightening and very beautiful sky.
But as you know, we are at the moment locked onto the international satellite and about to receive the first pictures of the lunar as they are recovered from the Pacific Ocean. For those of you who've only just tuned in, the news is that at 4:51 they splashed down safely within 8,000 yards of the flagship of the recovery fleet, the carrier Yorktown. Amazingly perfect shooting after a journey of 500,000 miles through space lasting over 6 days. And they have been in the water now, bobbing around, waiting to be picked up for over 1 hour. The carrier Yorktown is bearing down on them at full speed, and they are something just over 1 mile away from it at this moment, still inside their spaceship. And now back to the international satellite picture to see what's happening at this moment in the Pacific. We pick it up.
Remarkable. That's really quite an emotional moment for me, hearing those sounds played back. I recorded that in my parents' living room with my tiny microphone next to the loudspeaker in the television on December the 27th, 1968. And that's a recording of the landing and recovery of the module from Apollo 8 from somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. What an incredible testament to that piece of technology. One of my earliest radio experiences, and certainly one of the most exciting, when I was about 14, in the late 1960s, going to stay with my aunt and uncle in Scarborough on the East Coast, and standing on the beach and looking out to sea where the water met this blue horizon and scanning that line for the outline of a ship, what I thought would be a pirate ship, because what I was listening to when I was over there was pirate radio, Radio 270, some of the best music and some of the most exciting DJs. It was such an experience to go back and tune into this and feel part of this connected, almost counter-cultural circle. I guess lots of teenagers around the country were listening to their versions of pirate radio, but 270 really did it for me. And a station which has now been lost to the Marine Offences Broadcasting Act of 1967. So much so, and because of copyright issues, sadly I can't play you any of those recordings, but they're still out there in the ether and holding fast in people's imaginations. Back home in Sheffield, the experience of tuning into pirate radio stations made me want to investigate what was around the radio dial, and I started to tune in the evenings at night and just listen to what was around, what was available from shortwave, medium wave, and I came across the third program, which was morphing into Radio 3, and I just happened upon it at a time where I think it was a Stockhausen performance, and it just blew my mind as a teenager, listening to this strange, exotic, contemporary music for the first time. It was really absorbing. So I then became a regular visitor in the night time to the contemporary music played on the third program and Radio 3. And one evening in particular, I turned the dial and heard what sounded like the everyday sounds of a railway station. And it transpired what I was listening to was a piece of music created and composed by Pierre Schaeffer from sound recordings he'd made at a Parisian railway station. And this was musique concrète, music created from recordings of everyday sound. And what came out of Pierre Schaeffer's recordings was this. That was Etude au chemin de fer, composed by Pierre Schaeffer in 1948. Musique concrète has now been absorbed into everything from the culture of sampling right through to television commercials. And the creative aspects of that really interested and engaged me because I had a portable quarter-inch tape recorder. So I started making my own music with that machine, which I regarded as my instrument, and that led me to meeting up with some friends in Sheffield and starting a band, Cabaret Voltaire, which was a mixture of electronic music, found sound and musique concrète. And we made all sorts of recordings, and one of my all-time favourite broadcasters, the late great John Peel, played one of our tracks on his late night programme and introduced it as a piece of music, as a track that sounded like a fight in a radio studio, which for me was the ultimate accolade. Taking my tape recorder further afield, I became more and more absorbed in recording sounds on location, and in particular with experimenting with microphone techniques. At the moment I'm being recorded with what's called a personal microphone. This one, a small microphone pinned to my shirt. And I can tell you there are much more interesting places to use these microphones other than on people. And several years ago I was working in the Masai Mara in Kenya, and I wanted to record, a sight and a scene which we will have all seen on television, the act of vultures predating the carcass of an animal which has been killed and eaten the night before. And I went out early one morning and discovered a zebra carcass, really just the rib cage and the spine remaining. So I clipped 2 of my personal microphones to the rib cage of this unfortunate animal and buried a cable 50 metres back to a recording vehicle and waited for sunrise and waited for the vultures to descend upon this carcass and be all around my microphones. And hearing sounds like that from such close perspective, I think, really fires our imaginations in quite a unique way. That was one of my own special favourite recordings, the close-up sound of vultures predating a zebra carcass. Here's a programme recorded in the largest and most sound-rich habitat on the planet. First heard on Radio 4 in 1996, this is a documentary and unique musical compilation presented by Evelyn Glennie. This is Orchestra Under the Waves.
Like long tentacles, the white-tipped fingers of the tide claw their way up the beach, dragging loose stones back into the water. And as the waves retreat, listen carefully, and you might just hear an occasional strain of music escape from the depths and whisper quickly up the shore.
The first thing you hear when you leave the shore, of course, is the sound of waves breaking. The shore itself is a very noisy place. The water is sloshing about and the shingle is moving. But as you move away from the shore, and particularly as you move into calmer waters, then you start to pick up, first of all, the sounds from various invertebrates, crackling noises from snapping shrimps or crabs or prawns, stridulatory sounds from lobsters. Lobsters have a sort of system where they can rub their antennae against one another and produce a sound rather like a creaking door. And then as you get deeper, sounds from fish start to come in. You might hear a cod grunting or a pollock snoring away. It sounds rather like a snoring sound. As you get further offshore, you start to hear the whales and dolphins. You hear the screams and whistles that a dolphin makes, in addition to the echolocating sounds, which sound like trains of little sharp clicks, which are only just audible because they're at ultrasonic frequencies. As you go further north, you start to hear creaks and cracks as the ice breaks up. So the whole of the sea is full of noises. You can tell to some extent where you are by the sorts of sounds that you hear.
One of the things you notice when you're up in the polar zones walking around on top of the ice is just how different the snow feels and sounds underneath your feet, depending on the temperature. And it's the same when you watch a seal slithering across the snow. If it's 25, 30 below, then there's a kind of squeaky clean noise comes out the snow. If it's only 10 degrees below, then it's a much softer, kind of like almost like walking on a deep piled carpet. There's not so much noise. But one of the biggest contrasts that I notice is when you're diving underneath the ice. And as you slip through the layer of porridge ice on the top and then into this completely different world underneath, and if you hold your breath and don't exhale for a while and then let your bubbles trickle away towards the surface and then really concentrate on listening instead of looking, then you can become aware of all the animals underneath there which are outside your range of vision but which are there listening to you. And you can hear the sort of door creaking noise that crab-eater seals make. You can hear the long distant dropping whistle tone of Weddell seals, for example. You can hear belugas sort of chirping away in the distance. And you then begin to get a feeling for how important sound is to these animals in their environment. I mean, clear water you can probably see no more than 150 feet, and that's in very clear water. But when you start to talk about sound, you're talking about, 150 miles in some cases, with some sounds. And it's quite sobering to realise just how important this acoustic sense is underwater, rather than, being so reliant on vision.
I think fish use sounds really to make their feelings felt to one another. They've not really got any other way of demonstrating to one another what they're up to. They don't have arms or legs. It's difficult for them to change colour in the sort of medium that they're living in. And most animals need to signal to one another their intentions at some time or another. And fish tend to do this very often using sound. Some of them simply clap their fins against the body. Others vibrate their teeth. But the commonest mechanism is to have a pair of rather large muscles attached to a gas-filled organ called the swim bladder. Now, normally fish are heavy in water, and they have this gas-filled bladder to make them neutrally buoyant, so that they don't have to expend energy swimming up all the time. They have this big bladder of gas, and they have muscles attached to it, and effectively these contract very sharply, and every time they contract, it creates a sort of knocking or grunting sound. And by contracting the muscles in different ways, in different sequences, they can produce a great variety of different sounds. A fish like the haddock produces quite different sounds in different contexts. If it's, say, competing with food with another haddock, a fish will often produce a whole series of what sounds like knocking sounds. It will sort of go bum, 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 bum. Just a short sequence. Then, if it's a bit more aggressive, if it's, say, competing with another male for a mate, then it will run these a little bit faster and for a little bit longer. So it'll go bum, 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 bum. And then, as it gets involved in courtship and it becomes even more intense in his feelings for a female, say, then it will produce a great long sequence of these pulsed sounds, and it sounds rather like a motorbike revving up, sort of vroom, 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 and that can go on, quite literally in the case of a haddock, for hours.
The first time I ever heard a humpback song, I couldn't believe it. Best times to hear them is at night. They sing mostly at night. Listening from a sailboat, and you can drop a hydrophone over the side and you sort of lean back and you can watch the motion of the mast sweeping across stars. And then you soon become aware that that's what's fixing the rhythm of the song. It is the pulse of the sea, the swells that are passing under you, which are lifting and dropping the whale slowly and lifting and dropping your boat slowly. And that's one of the great experiences I've ever had. I've had it a lot, never tired of it, never will.
Across the ocean floor, the performers line up. Coloured fish, schools of dolphins, seals, walrus and humpback whales anticipate their performance cues as the sounds of the ocean echo between the rocky shore and sandy deep, between walls of coral and cliffs of polar ice.
The sea around the Hawaiian Islands at sunset is a very noisy place. As the sun goes down, the orchestra comes up, and the volume is turned up, and every creature, every species is showing off to show that it can make its own noise and do a better job at it than the next one. And it's literally a marine orchestra, a bit out of tune, but you have to hear it to appreciate it. In no way is it quiet.
The first time we actually went out to listen for common seal sounds, we didn't really know whether they made any noise at all or whether this was just actual speculation. So we were out in the boat and it was a beautiful, calm evening, and we were just underneath the Keswick Bridge here up at Inverness, and it took us half an hour before we actually realised that these sounds that we were hearing through the hydrophone were not lorries going over the bridge, which we first thought, but it was actually these seals calling. And as we drifted away from the bridge, these sounds got louder and louder, and it was a very magical moment. These males out there making this and trying to track females is quite incredible. Male common seals mate during July and form small territories within which they vocalise and perform very short dives. While they're descending, they start to release air, and this is usually the slow moaning noise, which crescendos out, and you'll have these loud burst pulses, which will be emitted when the male actually forces this air out of his throat, like a... And it's usually a very loud noise and can sound very much like a train going through a tunnel or toilet flushing.
One of the most exciting experiences I think I've had with dolphins was in New Zealand, swimming with dusky dolphins. And I remember we were on a boat being briefed as to what to do, because dolphins get bored very easily. So if you just get in the water and you hang on the surface, the chances are the dolphins might come and have a look. But they'll give you a dirty look and, you know, almost as if to say, look, you're being too boring, you're spoiling the party, and go on to somebody else who's doing something interesting for them to watch. And so we were told not only to swim around a lot and do loop-the-loop in the water and do anything to try and attract their attention, but also to sing through the snorkel. They love people singing songs, and apparently, I think the guy was kidding, but he said these particular dolphins liked UB40 songs, so we were all briefed on which ones to sing. And we got in the water. It was so exciting, I forgot every single UB40 song there's ever been, and all I could think of was the Yellow Submarine, which seemed quite appropriate at the time. And I was singing this through the snorkel. I think it lost a little bit in the translation. But I swear, 3 dolphins actually came up and they stopped in the water right in front of me. One actually turned around as if, you know, and perhaps they'd heard the song before, maybe other people had sung it to them, I don't know. But I swear also they started clicking and making noises and then swam off. But the adrenaline rush is just amazing.
Dolphins seem to make 2 quite distinct sort of sounds. They make whistles, which seem to have a function in communication, and they make clicks, which are used for echolocation, to find objects, to find their way around, to search for their food. The very simple way in which they work is just like a ball bouncing off a wall. They throw the click out, if you like, and they listen for it bouncing back again. And the simplest information that can give you is how far away the thing which reflects it, the wall if you like, is from the animal. And by carefully tuning in to the precise frequencies which are reflected back, the degree of reverberation, we know they can make very subtle discrimination between different sorts of objects using their echolocation clicks. So for instance, they can tell whether two spheres which look identical to us, whether they're solid or whether they're hollow, just by the way that those different materials reverberate when they're hit, if you like, by these clicks.
The funny thing with swimming with dolphins is you can hear them squealing and their sort of communication sounds, but the strangest thing is you can actually feel their echolocation clicks. And you know how if you're sometimes in a room and you sense somebody looking at you and you look around, well, that happens with dolphins all the time. You can be swimming along and you sense there's something behind you, and you have a look, and sure enough, maybe a few feet away, a few yards away, there's a dolphin. And what it probably is, it feels like the hairs on the back of your neck are standing on end. You can sense these echolocation clicks hitting you, and you can feel the dolphins checking you out.
Sound production in dolphins is something which is still not really very well understood. If you look at a dolphin's head, you see this sort of funny forehead, which is called a melon, and the nose, of course, is on top of the head. Now, on the passage from the outer nasal openings to the actual lungs, you have right underneath the blowhole several air sacs. And these air sacs can be basically inflated and deflated just like balloons. And that's sort of an air recycling system for dolphins, because the first problem they face, of course, is that they can't inhale underwater for the next sound they want to produce. So they need to recycle the air. But this sound is basically produced in the forehead, or if you want to compare it to a human, it would be somewhere in the nasal passage, not really in the larynx, which is a lot lower down. And then this vibration in the tissue is then transmitted through the forehead, through the melon, which is a fatty tissue which can be used as an acoustic lens, directly into the surrounding water. So what happens if a dolphin is calling is basically that if you look at the dolphin, you can't see a thing. You just hear a sound, because the sound is traveling directly through the head in the surrounding water.
Most of what we learn at this detailed level about how dolphins make clicks have been done with captive animals, and you can't take a sperm whale into captivity. So we know very much less about sperm whales, and they do seem to make their sounds in a very different way. Their clicks, although they are used for echolocation, the regular slow clicks that you can hear are very omnidirectional. They're not at all focused and beamed as most dolphin clicks are. What we can do is actually measure the size of sperm whales from their clicks. And that may seem surprising, but the explanation is that the sperm whale's head, where the sounds are made, is so big that the sound actually bounces around inside it between two air sacs, one at the front and one at the back. And underwater, air acts as a very good reflector of sound, so these are like two sound mirrors. And these click sounds are bouncing between them. So when you look at what sounds like one click with an oscilloscope, you'll see that there's actually several pulses of sound within it. And the time between those pulses is the time it takes for a sound to go from the front of the head to the back of the head. And obviously that's related very closely to the size of the animal itself. And what we think is happening is that the whales are also listening, attending to that, and assessing each other's size in that way. And one of the things that convinces me that this may be happening is that in males, the heads are proportionally larger than females. And if you look at a male sperm whale, its head really pokes out at the front as though there's been some adaptive process to make it as long as possible. And of course, in sperm whales, a male with a bigger head is going to sound bigger than he really is. So if there is this process of sizing each other up acoustically, the males with the big head, unfortunately, are going to win out.
But it's time for our journey to move on, beckoned by the distant calls of beluga whales caged beneath the Arctic ice.
One of the most exciting experiences up in the Arctic is to be able to get in the water with a group of belugas. Belugas are toothed whales, so they're in the same kind of order family as narwhals and killer whales, for example, and pilot whales. They're completely unmistakable because they're pure white. They have no dorsal fin, and that's reckoned to be a modification for where they live in the Arctic zones. They're unique among whales because they can swivel their head and look at you. Most whales' necks are fused, but belugas have this quite disconcerting ability to swim halfway past you and then turn around and look at you. And it's a bit odd because unlike most whales which need to look at you out the corner of your eye or turn their whole body to kind of face you, belugas can look at you, head on while at the same time swimming past you. They're also known as sea canaries because they are so musical. And sea canaries is a pretty good description of what they sound like. It's like being stuck in an aviary full of canaries, budgerigars, what have you, all chirping away to each other. And when you're in the water, if you've been in the water, you haven't seen any belugas, you know they're coming long before you see them because their sound precedes them.
I think the most memorable occasion was the first summer when I went to Cunningham Inlet, a bay in the high Canadian Arctic, and this is one of the estuaries where belugas come to start the molt process, usually in July. We had something like 1,000 belugas in the bay below us, and I remember swimming, finding myself surrounded by perhaps 10 or 15 big adult male belugas which were interrogating me by sound, trying to find out what I was made of. And when I stuck my head below the surface, I was just transported. It was an amazing sensation of being in a completely different world, because it's only when you stick your head under the water that you realize that they're in a totally different world where sound is so much more important than it is to us. And I came away just numbed by this experience, which was new to me, and here I am 10 years later, and it's like it just happened yesterday. It's something I'll never ever forget. It's like swimming with humpback whales for the first time. It's one of those defining moments in your life which you never forget.
They have whistles, which are very tonal calls, which sound like bird songs. And then you've got pulsed calls, and they're things like barks and grunts and squawks. And then you've got echolocation click series. And those are the sounds that are used for navigation and for targeting food items and foraging behavior. So you've got three broad categories, and within those categories, belugas do everything under the sun. Drop in the hydrophone, and that's when it truly sounds like there's an orchestra tuning up, and it's just constant whistling. And when you get thousands of animals emitting fairly complicated whistles like that, it's very hard to comprehend, and it's really an interesting situation.
Beluga whales are not the only extrovert performers. Rising and diving near the edge of an Arctic ice floe, a massive head and glistening white tusks reveals a walrus, whose elaborate repertoire is a fair match for the singing canaries.
They're very, very gregarious, and you find that the females in particular really like to go around in big bunches and lie up together, and even when it's 30 or 40 degrees below centigrade, they'll haul out on the ice sometimes and lie up against each other, and there'll be layers of ice frozen all over them. And they have a situation which is maybe a little bit more like red deer, where the females aggregate and males try to come around the females and advertise by singing underwater. And it's mostly a collection of taps and knocks in different combinations, so they'll go slowly like that, or they'll go very rapidly like that. They'll change pace, and what they do is they come up to the surface and they breathe a few times, and they get very ritualized about their vocalizations in the water, so that when a male is displaying, he dives down into the water and stays underwater for 4 to 6 minutes, only about 3 or 4 meters underneath the water, and holds a position. And then he just continues to give these taps and knocks for the most time. They also have some calls that sound very much like a guitar being strummed, which is quite bizarre. And they have a sound that just sounds like the purest sounding metallic church bell you've ever heard. But they give these calls for 5 or 6 minutes, and then they come up, and again, they're still in ritualized display mode, and while they're at the surface, they'll replenish their air supply with 5 or 6 breaths. And between each breath, they'll give exactly the same call each time. And they'll carry on in this stereotype manner, giving the same calls at the surface and the same calls underwater, sometimes for in excess of 48 hours in a row. Then I guess they must get a little tired out because they'll haul out and rest on the ice for a bit, and then they go back at it.
The underwater knocking and tapping sounds don't seem to come from teeth bashing. But what I think might be going on is that walrus are suction feeders, which means that essentially they're like big vacuum cleaners with bristles, and they just go along sucking up thousands of clams a day as their main food source. And their mouths are very adapted for this sucking. They've got a high vaulted arch in their mouth, extremely strong tongue, and one of the possibilities is that they use their tongue to create a suction against the roof of their mouth and make these clicking sounds, the same way that you and I could make a clicking sound with our tongue on the roof of the mouth, like. And to make these sounds louder, walruses have pharyngeal air sacs located on the sides of their neck. And what happens is they can shunt air into these pharyngeal air sacs and blow them up to about the size of basketballs. And they got one on each side. So when they're fully inflated, it looks like this walrus has got a severe case of mumps or something, but anyway, or he swallowed a basketball. But anyway, these are air-filled and can act as resonating and amplification chambers. And so that gives the knocking and tapping sounds, and probably that bell-like sound, its resonant, loud qualities.
The walrus calls, because of they're so sharp, they will actually travel underneath the water for 30 or 40 kilometers. So when we're recording, sometimes if there's a whole bunch of walruses calling at the same time, you have about the same effect as being on the inside of a plywood house with about a dozen or 20 carpenters on the outside with hammers, all hammering at the same time. It's just the most incredible racket. And I sometimes think that some of the walruses haul out on the ice just so they can get a little bit of peace of mind.
Meanwhile, far off in Antarctica, crab-eater seals hold forth with their monotonous songs of monogamy, leopard seals reply with a lyrical verse, whilst Ross's seals throw back their heads and strike a quiet pose. But it's the Weddell seals which outshine the other performers on the icy stage.
The surface repertoire is primarily between the mothers and their pups. And it's a series of bawling and calling back and forth, sort of roar kind of sound, or man, like baby lambs or sheep calls. And it's a fairly limited repertoire. The mothers call back and forth. Somehow the mothers are recognizing their own pups among the colony, but it's probably a combination of vocal cues and scent. They have a lot of nose-to-nose contact. But when you go underwater, we have this elaborate repertoire of vocalizations, 34 different sounds. Of those, 10 are calls that we call trills. Some of them are up to 193 decibels, which is an incredibly high amplitude sound. Some of them last for 75 seconds in duration. But because they're so long and so loud in intensity, we believe that those calls are only produced by males. So some of their trills would sound like chug, 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 chug. You see, I can't hold my breath for 75 seconds or make a vocalization in 75 seconds, so I'm not a very good Weddell seal. But they also have a series of calls that we believe are aggressive calls used in territorial disputes underwater. And these are aggressive chug-type calls, and they're usually used in series. So they would be something like chug, 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 chug. And we believe as they increase the repetition rate, it's conveying an increase in aggression levels. And sometimes you'll see the chugs do the opposite, where it seems that the male is highly aggressive and then his motivation sort of wanes, if I can be anthropomorphic. So it's more chug, 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 So those are aggressive calls.
When they make that noise, the whole shoulders sort of hunch. Well, as much as a seal has shoulders, but it'll take up this kind of posture in the water. Usually, they can be swimming, but often they're sort of diagonally stationary in the water, and they hunch their whole shoulders. And, sort of and they seem to do that on the edge of their territory, whereby the males spend a lot of their time just cruising round the borders of their territory, seeing off other males with that grunting display. That's another thing that must have amazed the early explorers. You can imagine the first guy to hear this sort of thing. He must have wondered what on earth was going on. I've never had a Weddell seal grunt at me, but actually I could do quite a good grunt back at it. That'd be an interesting one to try, just to see. You'd probably end up with it coming and biting your leg off or something, but it would be interesting to grunt back to a Weddell seal.
And whilst the seals of Antarctica grunt and warble to one another, further north in the Atlantic Ocean, near Bermuda, strains of another song echo through the water. This beautiful and mournful ballad echoes across the ocean floor, and like a serenade invites other whales to join the courtship song.
This is all the performance of a single animal, a single humpback whale. It's a male singing. Now there are two low grunts, almost impossible to hear, and then this, which sounds like a car. And at the end of this long sound, this motor, which isn't a motor, it's a whale, it repeats exactly what it just did before. Now this is the second utterance, then, of the phrase of the first theme. Now, having completed that sound, it starts going into theme 2 without any break, and theme 2 is a climbing set of notes that are going to get higher and higher, and which isn't conveniently broken down into phrases that repeat. It's just a series of climbing notes. He's presumably singing in hopes of a female. The song is not random at all. It's completely controlled by the whale. It's a performance which starts with has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and which takes anywhere from 5 minutes to 30 minutes to perform. And it is the same each time it makes it. The thing that's different is the numbers of times a particular phrase is sung. So if a whale is going, it might do that 20 times in one song, the next time twice. But it won't leave it out often. But what it will never do is it will never change the order of that theme. It won't sing that theme, if that was theme 1, as it was the example I gave you there. It would never make it between 2 and 3. It will always sing it before 2 and after the last theme. But leaving out themes is something that's actually fairly common. And as the season progresses, however, it seems like the whales sing more complete songs, which kind of indicates that maybe it's something that is important to sing the complete version of. Now, as time goes on, whales will take sections of the song and they'll change them. So that, for instance, we had something which went boop, that very deep growl, and boop, boo, and the boo became boop, 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 and eventually that became boop, boop, and then that became boop, 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 down in a series of sounds until it was totally different. So if you'd heard ooh, ooh, and then later on you'd heard ooh, 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 which was what it became, you'd have thought, no relation at all. Absolutely a relation. At every step you can follow the evolution of that sound. So whales are different than you and me. If we had the assignment of each writing a song, you would retire to your corner, I would retire to mine, and we'd write a song. And it would be totally different. But if you did this with whales, and you somehow could assign them this thing, get them to make their song would be evolved from the song that they were singing at that time. It would not be a de novo, brand new invention. It would, like human songs, obey the same laws of construction, a very strict set of laws of construction. And the weird thing is that many of the laws of construction of whale songs have many tonal sounds and very few percussive sounds, like human songs. And songs which have sometimes an ABA construction, in other words, a little theme, then a different one, then a return to the first theme, to the A version. Whales do that too. They even employ rhyme, which is something that Katie Payne, my former wife, discovered. So there are wonderful parallels between the songs that whales sing and the songs that humans sing, and yet there is not a chance that we and whales had any knowledge of each other's singing during all those millions of years that our ancestry was separated. So all during that time, some collection of choices were being made by whales and by people, and they all ended up sounding very, very similar. There are lots of people who weep when they hear whale songs, and I think it suggests to me that singing is older than our species, and I feel therefore it suggests that one of the things that makes it so hard for you to describe, me to describe, what it is that we get out of music is the fact that you can't put words to it, and the reason you can't put words to it is because it precedes words too. I think it precedes everything, basically. It is the quintessential expression of emotion in vertebrates, and I think we got it from our vertebrate ancestry. I think that singing maybe even predates vertebrates.
For centuries, the sounds of the deep have echoed across the ocean's floor, and as our journey reaches its end, white beluga whales take the lead, humpback whales follow suit, and then leopard and hooded seals, oyster catchers, gulls, terns, and a whole assembly of creatures join in the natural rhythms from the orchestra under the waves. Tony Hawkins and John Bothwell were bopping with the fish, Doug Allen dived beneath the polar ice, whilst Sophie Van Parish eavesdropped on harbour seals. Jonathan Gordon, Vincent Janik and Mark Carwardine beat a rap with clicking dolphins and sperm whales, whilst Becky Sher and Ian Stirling were entertained by walrus. Jeanette Thomas tapped out rhythms with Weddell seals. Becky Sher also joined Tony Martin to warble with the singing canaries, whilst Roger Payne sang with humpback whales. The music, which was composed entirely from the natural sounds of the ocean, was orchestrated and conducted by David King.
Orchestra Under the Waves was recorded almost entirely with hydrophones, which are specialised underwater microphones, instruments that I really enjoy using. And I've come down this morning to one of my favourite waterside locations, Blythe Harbour in Northumberland, and I'm going to try my luck off the pier and do some fishing for sound. And I've got a couple of hydrophones which are lower. It's high tide, lower them about 3 metres below the surface, and I just love that moment when I put the hydrophones in the water, putting the headphones on and just listening to what is really another place, another world. It's actually really busy, and what I can hear now is the snap, crackle and pop of pistol shrimps. And these are quite small crustaceans that hang around the staves underwater, and they have asymmetric claws, one very large claw and one ordinary sized claw, and they hang there waiting for a tasty morsel to come swimming past or floating past, and then they snap their large claw shut with such speed and power that it creates a vacuum underwater. And as the water fills that vacuum, it makes this really loud snap, crackle and popping sound, which actually stuns or kills passing prey. So these tiny crustaceans are using sound as a weapon under the surface. However, you don't have to come to such exotic locations as Blythe Harbour to hear the most amazing wildlife sounds. Let's go home to my back garden. Just listen to that. I've travelled the world recording wildlife sounds, and that's one of my favourites, a blackbird, recorded here in my suburban garden. You really don't need to go to the ends of the earth to hear the most remarkable wildlife sounds. Here, from Radio 3's sound-rich series Between the Ears, is part of a programme called 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, produced by David Gallagher.
Among 20 snowy mountains, the only moving thing was the eye of the blackbird.
Such a lovely eye they've got.
Because they've got that yellow rim around them.
Blackbird eyes are incredibly piercing. You can't not notice if a blackbird is looking at you.
Sometimes they look very fierce.
You see this one peering eye, little black bead, never face you full on.
They're very handsome, aren't they? In their black overcoats and orange accessories.
I mean, you'd think something black wouldn't be anything, but it's so glossy.
The lady ones are all brown, aren't they? And they're all brown, the babies, to start with.
The male is the easy one. He's black, beautiful golden yellow bill and a very narrow yellow ring round the eye as well. The female is a bit more complicated because they are so variable. Sort of brown bird, basically, but a dull, rather dark brown. We get an awful lot of telephone calls at the RSPB about this strange bird in the garden, which may be a dark bird with a speckly breast, or surprisingly reddish or chestnut-coloured underneath. So the males are certainly black, but the young birds and the females aren't, which makes the name
very sexist. I think the blackbird seem to be the control of the garden.
The blackbird exudes class, complete class. He's the streetwise guy in the camel coat. Only it's a black camel coat, who all other birds know and respect.
They're very territorial. They do a funny sort of chase each other, almost the same as when they're sorting for a mate, with their heads sort of forward and start lifting their wings.
And they open their little beaks and just sort of jump up and down.
It's a standoff, isn't it, really?
The funny thing is, they will sometimes lose their food because if another blackbird appears, they'll put their head down and charge, and it's far more important to chase another one off. Somebody else will swoop in and get their food. There never seems to be any sort of battle.
Oh yes, they have one under them and scream they will.
They fly up in the air and all their feathers, they look double the size.
They go for each other's chest.
Like cockfighting, I guess.
It's likely to be the more aggressive and the more noisy confrontational ones that are going to be the survivors, and the sort of meek and reasonable chaps. These meek are not going to inherit the earth.
And blackbirds are territorial against their young. Once they finish feeding, when the young come back to follow them, they look as if they can't understand what's going on because the male just pecks them until they do go. It's part of training for them to fend for themselves. They've got to go and look for their own food, so it's being cruel to be kind, I suppose.
That was 13 ways of looking at a blackbird. Of course, it's impossible to tell the story of the advances in sound design without mentioning the heroic efforts of the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, and 2018 marks 60 years since it was created. The Radiophonic Workshop was responsible for creating the atmospheres around another genre I've always loved, the ghost story. I think radio is the perfect medium for a ghost story, and if radio always has the best pictures, then these are some of the scariest.
Best way to find out is evidently to whistle for him. Still in working order? That's remarkable. Splendid, splendid. Goodness me, what forces the wind can get up in a few minutes. What a tremendous gust. There. I knew that window fastening was no use. All 3 candles out. It's enough to tear the room to pieces. I'll have to get this window shut somehow. That's better. Well, that really made me quite uneasy.
A stellar soundtrack from the Radiophonic Workshop in the classic M.R. James ghost story, Oh Whistle and I'll Come to You, starring Michael Hordern. Thank you for joining me, Chris Watson, on this journey into sound.
Chris will be back next week when he'll share some of his favourite radio moments in the Changing Sound of Radio Episode 2, 15 inches per second. The series is produced by Jessica Treen.